Okay, so the first thing I want to go over in these tips and tricks is learning styles and how that relates to repetition. The idea is that there are many different learning styles, and students are stronger in one than another. Sometimes, maybe most of the time, I haven't actually done deep research on this. Um, you have also the typical left brain, right brain dichotomy that you may be familiar with. So one is more logical, charts, graphs, organizers, and then the other is creativity, music. Music is actually pretty mathematical anyways. So engaging different parts of the brain helps learning set in deeper. So if you can get a student to, read and write some vocabulary, reading is visual, writing is a bit kinesthetic, but also visual. Reading out loud is visual and auditory, so it may be useful to think about how different activities that you have fall into overlapping or different categories. So, and then again, the idea is repeating it in different ways may help students learn it better or more thoroughly. Functional classroom phrases, we found this is helpful. Like the example from before is, students knowing like, hey, you're on mute, and we have a teacher who holds up like a little, she actually printed it out, it's a much nicer sign, but she holds up a sign saying, hey, you're on mute, and the students know without getting caught up in the language form, they know the function, right, of to unmute themselves. So good classroom, like kind of, I guess, yeah, functional phrases, like, okay, now like you listen or you repeat after me so students know what to do without getting caught up in the wording. Also having them know how to say, can you repeat, or can you spell that for me, can you explain? So reviewing or teaching question words early on may be helpful, or having like a translation card that they can point to in their home language, just so they are getting the information they need. So for clarification or understanding, but also just knowing when to move on or translate for them, or give up sounds bad. But again, time is a resource, so getting stuck on little or things that don't necessarily matter may not be the best for everyone. So teacher talk times is something we see, like I'm sure you could go back through my videos and see all the ums and likes and filler words. And so when you're learning a new language, you don't necessarily know how to filter out those filler words, and you're trying to process every single syllable that comes out of a teacher's mouth. And so if you're going on a tangent, like I have seen and I have also done, that can be very exhausting for students because they don't know that it's not do or die information, if that makes sense. So knowing that deer in the headlights look, and when talk is over their heads. So we also want to enunciate and speak slower, but balancing that with authentic language that they may hear in real life situations. So, and if they ask you to slow down, of course, slow down, but give them, like a lot of times when we do listening exercises, we read through a text once at a more native speaker pace, and then we read through it a second time much slower, enunciating, and sometimes stopping to explain if there's questions. So, oh, and also just teacher talk time in general, be aware of how much time you're taking up. We want students kind of engaged and producing language themselves. So errors and correction, this is a bit of a longer section. Here is maybe I'll click on it. So here's a good site that goes over different ways to correct errors, a bit more than what I have on my PowerPoint. So if you want to check it out, it looks like the site has a lot of good articles and lessons. So it is listed there for you. Anyways, so we want to find a balance between our goal should be fluency and accuracy, but we want to balance that with like an overall goal of intelligibility. So that means not getting hung up on certain disfluencies or inaccuracies, but to a certain extent, just as long as they're communicating what they want to communicate, rolling with it, unless it's something you're specifically focusing on. So, example, if you're doing a lesson on grammar and word order, don't necessarily spend a ton of time on pronunciation, as long as you can tell what they're saying. This, of course, is subject to change based on specific learner goals. Again, their goal could be pronunciation, like they want to get rid of their accent, which is debatable as whether or not, like, anyways. The danger of fossilization, and there's a normal learning process. So you do want to be aware that there are certain errors that students habitually make, and having those errors fossilize makes it much more difficult to undo them. So addressing consistent, egregious errors before they set in may be helpful, and you could do that through something such as modeling or recasting what they said in the right way, so at least they're hearing the correct form. And then there is a normal learning process that takes place, and so they can overgeneralize certain rules as they learn them, such as saying goed instead of went, even though they've been able to use went before, they suddenly learn the ed rule, and so they apply it everywhere. So I'm just noting that that's, in irregular form. And you also see actually children do this as they acquire the ed rule. So knowing the difference between mistakes and errors. And so it's not necessarily important that you know how to point out, oh, that was a mistake, oh, that was an error. But knowing that there is a difference in how to address that. So a mistake is something that a student has the knowledge to self-correct. Like we see a lot of getting mixed up with the him, her, it pronouns. And so the student has the knowledge to self-correct. Sometimes they do that, sometimes they don't. You could ask, if you're talking about the chair, like, oh, she's too short, but obviously they're talking about the chair. You're like, what's too short? And so that's kind of recasting it as a question so they know it wasn't quite right, and then they can self-correct. Versus an error is something that they don't actually have the knowledge to self-correct, and whether or not you want to delve into that error is kind of up to you. So it could be, using a verb tense that's a simple verb tense when a more complex one would have been more appropriate. Yeah. And so sources of errors and mistakes, a lot of them come from the student's first language. And so knowing patterns in the first language, like grammar patterns, knowing they usually put the adjective before the noun is a pattern and a source. So knowing a bit about that in the home language can help target specific problems learners are having. So there can be mistakes and in both production and reception. So an example is students have trouble producing the TH sound, but they probably don't have trouble hearing it, versus certain students may have trouble hearing certain sounds, like the R sound. I believe it's Japanese that doesn't differentiate phonetically between the R and the L, so they may need to have that difference pointed out so they can actually perceive the error they're making. So it's more difficult to pinpoint and target receptive problems. So immediate versus delayed feedback, and this is just how much do you want to interrupt your student, interrupt their production. Delayed feedback is useful for writing, and so there's more articles on that, but there is just a difference in that. So, and just it's up to you to weigh the pros and cons of how you want your lesson and teaching to flow. And then, does it sound right to you is something that is common, and I've definitely said to students before. And so at a certain point and in some occasions, that's maybe a valid question, but a lot of times, like, it does sound right to them, and that's why they said it like that. So asking that isn't necessarily a great way to help them self-correct. So these are just different techniques for errors and correction. So direct correction is like, no, it's actually blank. Repeating it back to them, this is usually for pronunciation. So like with the TH sound and enunciating with your tongue visible between your teeth, or with repeat the same thing back to them with a questioning tone, like he take it, versus like he takes it, or he took it, depending on what you're trying to elicit. Reformulation or recasting, so modeling the correct form. I think we went over that earlier, asking for clarification. Metalinguistic, so just saying, using talk about, well, we went over past tense, how would you see that in past tense? So, And then here is a list of praise and prompts, ways to say right and wrong. The one that I wanted to go over is saying wrong in a different way, so framing it as we instead of you. And again, this gets back to the idea of the effective filter. Too much negative feedback could deter future attempts, and we want them to keep trying. We want them comfortable making mistakes with us so they make less mistakes out like in the real world where it may be more unforgiving. So, saying like that's close or almost, that's a tricky one. Like, let's try that again. Oops, which is, I thought it was funny when I read it, but I'm sure I've used it. Saying I forgot to explain this is a particularly good one when it is an error. So, but it's something that they can easily learn. So then eventually it just becomes a mistake that they can self-correct. This one is kind of funny. English has a lot of crazy spellings. That's kind of like a motto for sure. Then this causes trouble for a lot of people. Would you like an example? Is a great one because then it gives you an opportunity to speak and then also write it out for them. I found a lot of students find seeing it written out is very helpful. So I also enjoy seeing things written out. So, and then this one's funny. The question doesn't make sense. Let's just skip it. So I've definitely seen that. You don't agree with everything your textbook writers say. So comprehension checks. This one is useful. We want to check early and check often, although this shouldn't be like a huge interruption of the class flow. I've seen success with the stoplight, red, yellow, green. Now, you have a red one, or you say, I have a question. So just checking it, being in dialogue about that. So, and it can be verbal, it can be visual, but you want to make sure that they're not just saying, oh yeah, all good, just to please you. So being a bit more intentional in that. So, and it should be easier in a small group setting. So, wait time. Nobody likes the awkward silence when you ask a question. You just get like blank stares, deer in the headlights. And so just awareness of some students, especially beginning students, go through a silent or receptive phase where it's like when babies can't talk yet, but they're intaking a lot. They comprehend a lot more than they can produce. And so giving more wait time in the silent period will just result in you guys staring at each other, and it may raise that effective filter, like, oh, this is awkward, and I know it's awkward, but I don't know what they want, but like I don't even know how to ask them to repeat it. So awareness of that, having clues or prompts or alternative ways of answering ready, like, oh, like would it help you if you spelled it out, or can you sound it out? So breaking it down, scaffolding for success in that. So, and then if necessary, circle back or move on. And then calling on students in groups, this is more specifically if you have a small group, and our limit for small groups is no more than 6 per group. So, but this is also, again, important for a classroom setting. Why is this being ridiculous? Look at this. I just showered. Sorry, I've been kind of trying to dry my hair as I've been talking. Anyways, so knowing everyone's names is important. Ideally, your tutoring will be a small group, so this should be manageable. Although pronunciation can trip people up, it's definitely worth taking the time, saying, how do you pronounce your name, and making an effort to get that right. And starting with easy questions. When you ask a question to the group, start with, like, okay, who knows what this word is? And it's like a very obvious sight word, like and. And then to build confidence and, oh, I want to get it right, I can do this, participation, and then having harder questions to work up to. If students call out, that's fine. We don't want to necessarily shut that down completely, but I've often seen like, oh, I called on so-and-so, let's give them a chance to answer. And so maybe giving a new question to that person who didn't get to answer until they do answer. And then if it continues, you could just put the person on mute. And then there are times and places when you can tell them, okay, just shout it out if like when you're brainstorming or when you're, so just knowing when to use different modes of answering. And so recommended resources, just want to talk through some of this quickly. Bilingual picture dictionary is very useful in whichever language is applicable. These are, like little print books. Maybe there's online versions. I've had one in French and I had one in Spanish. Those are very useful. ABC English is a great resource. They have a systematic phonics curriculum that is very useful for the pre-literate students. We have 1 or 2 tutoring groups using that currently right now. There's a 30-day free trial available. And then Tarjimly is that interpretation site, app, service that's useful. And then these different sites are ESL focused and literacy and language learning, and a lot of them have free resources and great informed educational articles. These two. Excuse me. Mission to North America offers ESL training. This is specifically geared toward if you're trying to start an ESL ministry through your church. And then, of course, you have us, Catholic Charities Harrisburg, and this is our resource page, and I'll just take you to it. It's just a WordPress that I made where I was keeping a lot of the reference and educational sites that I use. So you see a lot of government sites with data and immigration status, or immigration statistics, sorry. And so a lot of these, so you see the Colorado one listed, MNA listed, but then we have a lot of local ones, and then etc. So yes, and then this is just all the books I use. So thank you for sticking with me. And stop.